The Nvidia ADA microarchitecture has brought a lot of impressive gains on the performance per watt front. But at the same time, the efficiency has come at a high cost, turning a lot of consumers off from the formerly mid-range to high-end cards as they've nearly doubled in price. However, the RTX 4060 supposedly offers 60 class performance for the lowest amount of money in the ADA lineup, and for a price less than last gen's RTX 3060. While I have some squabbles about this being a true 60 class offering, the power efficiency along with the raw performance make this card an interesting and compelling buy if you're looking for RTX functionality on a somewhat budget. Before we get into this video, I'd like to say not to forget to hit the like button and subscribe, so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Additionally, don't forget to leave a comment, especially if there's something that I missed. I can't cover every aspect of a card in the relatively short duration of a video, but I more so wanted to discuss some benchmarks than dive into the specifications to further dissect its performance. Without anything else to say, let's dive into the test system to see how the 4060 performs in games. To give the 4060 a shot at fully stretching its legs, I've gone ahead and paired the card with an i5-13600K, a 6+8 core chip clocked to 5.5 GHz on the performance cores and a flat 4 GHz on the efficiency cores. The performance cores in this chip will allow the 4060 to perform as well as it possibly can. The efficiency cores, in theory at least, allow the background tasks to be taken off the performance cores, freeing up additional cycles for games. In practice, it does this sometimes, and other times games will attempt to run on all the cores. After running a few tests over with the i7-9700K, I found that the 13600K performs better in almost all scenarios and also helps smooth out some stutters found in a lot of modern games. To keep the CPU and GPU fed with data, we've got 64 gigs of 3.6 gigabit per second DDR4, which while not as fast as lower end DDR5, it'll perform adequately for the purposes of this video, and won't bottleneck the CPU, especially when paired with a 4060. It's also worth noting that this card has an OC and a silent BIOS that you can switch between on the top of the card. For testing, I ran with the OC BIOS because it wasn't running all that loud, to be honest. The specific motherboard and cooling solution used are in the description, along with other system spec details I thought were important to bring up. Without any further ado, let's dive into the RTX 4060 and see how this card performs in games. Starting off with the traditional initial benchmark. Apex Legends ran incredibly well at all the resolutions tested, including 4K. Would I recommend running Apex at 2160p on this card? Probably not, but the fact that it can do this just shows that the card is still capable of running esports titles at competitive settings and frame rates at reasonable resolutions. This game is also built on the older DirectX 11, which really likes GPUs with higher shader clocks, explaining the good performance that we're seeing. At 1080p, the 4060 returned an average and 1% low of 263 and 189 FPS, which makes it high refresh rate capable at this particular resolution. Even moving up to 1440p, the average came in at 199 and 1% low of 150. This is also very playable, and although it's at competitive settings, this is probably what most users will do to gain the most performance from their system. 4K returned an average of 117 and a 1% low of 82, which remains beyond playable, but ultimately you'd probably be better off lowering the resolution and gaining those extra frames. The OG game that brought PCs to their knees in the late 2000s, Crysis, well, in this case Crysis Remastered since it's built on a more modern graphics API, ultimately performed kind of where I expected it to, but it showed some odd performance trends when moving from 1080 to 1440p. At the lowest resolution tested, you can see that the game returned an average and 1% low of 198 and 94 FPS respectively, which is ultimately very playable. But moving to 1440p, and the game's maximum performance actually got slightly higher, with the 1% lows also increasing. The average still came in lower at 150, indicating that performance was in fact lower on average, but still 1440p is beyond playable on this card. Even moving up to 4K, the 4060 achieved an average of 71 and a 1% low of 59, which to me is playable but is right on that threshold. Granted, this is at medium settings, but I've mentioned this in my A750 videos and it seems to behave the same way on the 4060. Moving the settings up to high completely tanks performance and makes the game basically unplayable at 1440p and above. I'd recommend sticking to the medium settings in this game no matter what hardware you've got, as it provides the best middle ground between graphical fidelity and performance. Counter-Strike 2, the new CS:GO replacement built on the upgraded Source 2 engine, ultimately performed well like Apex, but is depressed when compared to the older Global Offensive implementation. This game is now actually demanding on the GPU, which is exemplified by the 4K performance, which came in at 145 FPS on average, or a little over 42% lower than the average achieved at 1440p. 1080p still performed well, with the average and 1% low coming in at 298 and 113 FPS respectively. However, at the same time, graphical effects such as smoke are way more demanding on this version of CS, so keep that in mind as it may be worth lowering the settings from what we're testing at. 1440p provided an average of 247 FPS and a similar 1% low to 1080p, with it coming in at 112. This is probably because of the aforementioned smoke effects, which drag the performance down at all resolutions. But the fact that it remains consistent between 1080 and 1440p is strange. This game runs well when judged on its own merits, but compared to CS:GO, it's definitely a step forward in graphical and world fidelity. Cyberpunk 2077, this generation's Crysis, performed well at 1080p but rapidly degenerated at 1440p. The average and 1% low of 103 and 71 FPS at 1080p are beyond playable, and make for an excellent experience gameplay and graphics-wise. However, at 1440p, stutter becomes an issue, with the 1% low coming in at 48, the average at 62, and the absolute maximum at 73. This may look playable, but in reality I'd probably kick on DLSS as things are just not performing particularly well. 4K isn't even worth discussing beyond it can technically do it, but even at the lowest settings, it's still going to be a sub 40 FPS experience on average, and definitely below 60 at most. Just because this feature piqued my interest, I decided to test Cyberbug with frame generation. This also kicks on regular DLSS upscaling, which helps to improve the base frame rate, hopefully reducing the overall system latency brought on by introducing frame generation in the graphics pipeline. At 1080p, this technology is honestly incredible, and makes the game look way smoother. I will say that the average of 195 FPS isn't a straight doubling of performance, but it's pretty close at this and other resolutions. 1440p's average and 1% low came in at 122 and 102 FPS respectively, which solves some of the visual smoothness issues, but still doesn't resolve the game feeling kind of sluggish at times, though I will say those times are definitely less frequent. 4K also saw a frame rate improvement, but didn't really improve the feel of the game tremendously like you'd expect with an almost doubling of average performance. My impression of this technology, based on this implementation at least, is that it's a great thing to enable if you're already hitting your performance targets. So for example, if you're hitting 100 FPS already, then turning on frame generation is a great way to enhance the visual fluidity of your game. But if you're struggling to hit your performance targets and want extra frames, this may help improve how your game looks, but it won't improve the overall latency that you'd expect to be inversely proportional with an increase in frame rate. It's definitely a cool feature to have, but at this point in time, like ray tracing and DLSS 1.0 in 2018, it's just in its first generation, so you aren't missing out on much if your current GPU doesn't support it. Up next is an Unreal Engine 5 title, and for what it is, it performs pretty well. Fortnite, the still relatively popular esport game, returned an average of 248 FPS at 1080p and a 1% low of 104. The 1% lows look kind of odd, and is also consistent between 1080 and 1440p. This isn't usually the case, but if it bothers you, keep in mind that we're testing at medium settings, so there's still some headroom if you're comfortable with lowering the settings. 1440p offered still very competitive and playable performance, with the average and 1% low coming in at 166 and 96 FPS respectively. 4K was also playable, with an average and 1% low of 80 and 58 FPS, but realistically it's not that competitive when compared to 1440 and 1080p. It's kind of odd how performance scales in this game, but considering it's a first-party title on this particular engine, it runs well and looks great, and if you want to, you can enable ray tracing, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it on this hardware. The next game on this test suite is Halo Infinite, a DirectX 12 game from Microsoft that performs pretty well on the Xbox Series S and X. This strong performance trend continues on the 4060, with the average and 1% low coming in at 182 and 148 FPS at 1080p. 1440p was still playable and competitive, with an average of 121 and a 1% low of 105. But moving up to 4K, things weren't really that competitive. With an average of 62, things looked playable on the 4060 at these settings, but the 1% low of 52 showed that performance was dipping at times, and was cut in half when moving up from 1440p. For the best experience on this title on this hardware, I'd recommend sticking to 1440p and below, but the fact that it can run 4K is a nice to have. If you're comfortable with going to competitive settings, then performance might improve a little on average, but the 1% lows will ultimately remain pretty similar. Our next game is the first IW 9.0 title, and it should give a sneak peek into how this year's iteration should perform. Warzone 2, or now just Warzone again, in this test at the minimum preset, performed well at 1080 and 1440p, but ultimately kind of fell apart at 4K. With an average and 1% low of 171 and 131 FPS at 1080p, this card provides a very competitive experience, even though the frame rates are dipping below the competitive 144 FPS mark at times. 1440p remained beyond playable, with an average of 125 and a 1% low of 94. So if you want to increase the resolution, then the hardware is happy to comply. 4K though came in with an average and 1% low of 67 and 52 FPS, which while it seems playable, the game stuttered at times and made me want to turn the resolution back down to 1440p. Because this is the minimum preset, we can't do much to claw back performance besides enable DLSS, which if you're wanting additional frames at any resolution would be smart to turn on. This segues into our next title, but this one ultimately performed pretty well, and I'd comfortably play Warzone competitively on the 4060. The next title is the Modern Warfare 3 beta, and although performance seems to be depressed when compared to Warzone 2, it still ran perfectly fine at the basic graphics preset. With an average and 1% low of 159 and 121 FPS at 1080p, this is beyond competitive, and realistically provides headroom to either raise some graphical details if this preset looks questionable to you, or enable DLSS. 1440p remained beyond playable, with the 1% low coming in at 85 and the average at 110. 4K was also sort of playable, but it wasn't really competitive, with the game maxing out at 75 FPS and averaging 61. The 1% low came in at 44, so performance on average at this resolution is just outright worse, and I'd recommend avoiding it if you want a more competitive experience. For 1080 and 1440p, this card does excellently in this game, and given that it's a beta, things do have the potential to improve slightly, though I wouldn't necessarily count on it. Performance is already fine, and on this particular system, the 4060 was definitely the bottleneck, so I'd say that it's using the hardware appropriately. Up next is a less popular version of the classic hero shooter, but it ultimately performs pretty similarly, probably thanks to it being on a similar engine and the same graphics API. Overwatch 2 performed very well at all the resolutions tested at the high preset, and was beyond competitive even at 4K. At 1080p, the average and 1% low came in at 424 and 280 FPS, which is enough to satisfy almost all high refresh rate Full HD monitors available today. If you want to jump up to 1440p, then the performance remains very competitive, with an average of 291 and a 1% low of 229 FPS. 4K came in at 130 FPS on average, which is still playable, but is less competitive than the previously mentioned resolutions, which is ultimately to be expected. The 1% low of 87 was also still very playable, so if you're wanting to get into some Overwatch, then the 4060 can run it very well thanks to its incredibly high clock speeds and probably also the cache. Our first Vulkan title, Red Dead Redemption 2, ran excellently considering the type of game that it is. Keep in mind that this is at the balanced preset, or roughly equivalent to the Xbox One X settings, so if you want additional frames, then you are able to turn off some of the settings or turn them down. But in practice, this hurts the visual fidelity of the game a bit too much for my liking. Either way, at 1080p the game performed excellently, with an average of 119 and a 1% low of 93. While performance did go down when jumping up to 1440p, the average and 1% low of 85 and 67 was still playable. And since this isn't a competitive online multiplayer game, 60 FPS on average is a perfectly fine target, and in some cases even an overkill one. Because of that, I'd probably raise some of the settings, such as anisotropic texture filtering and the volumetric lighting resolution, just to get some increased fidelity on ambient lighting and texture work. However, if you're more comfortable with a more console-like frame rate, then 4K would actually be fine on this system. Unlike GTA 5, which I removed from this test suite due to the 188 FPS engine bug, explosions didn't completely tank performance, and it was pretty stable when considering this is a $300 card playing a game at 4 times the market resolution. With an average and 1% low of 49 and 42 FPS, the grouping was way tighter on 4K than the other resolutions, indicating that the card is able to run it, but it's definitely struggling more to display these frames. Once again, this card can technically run Red Dead 2 at 4K at playable frame rates, but 1440 and 1080p were so much more enjoyable that I'd probably stick to that, or at least enable DLSS if you're wanting to target 4K. The actual architecture of the 4060 is kind of interesting because it's able to hit the performance targets that it does with so little. I mean, just looking at the card, you can tell that it's obviously more on the inexpensive side. Ignoring the heatsink, just the power delivery on the almost all 4060s is designed to deliver about 125 watts at most, but a majority of the time you're going to be sitting lower on the power curve to maintain the efficiency of the components. While under load, the card peaks at under 120 watts, with the 100 watt mark coming up quite frequently. However, there is a wall in the BIOS that locks overclocking on this particular flavor. This limits overclocking headroom, and on software like MSI Afterburner, you literally can't increase the power limit at all. As a result, the card never really draws that much power when compared to the 13600K used in testing, even if you decide to tune some things. As a result, the card only has a single 8-pin PCIe power connector, which kind of harkens back to the Pascal days when it comes to relative efficiency. Most 4060s feature only an 8-pin, but I have seen some low-profile editions without any connectors. But just keep in mind that those will be more power limited than ones with supplementary connectors available. The die featured on the 4060 is the fully unlocked TSMC 4N based AD107 400A1 graphics processing unit, which, if you recall, would traditionally be the tier of die reserved for the 50 and 50 Ti series. With 18.9 billion transistors though, this card actually has more raw active elements in the die than Ampere's GA104, which only had 17.4 billion transistors. Other specifications later on will explain this high transistor count, but keep in mind that not all these transistors are dedicated to compute pipelines. The chip features 24 ADA SMs equating to 3072 FP32 and FP16 CUDA cores, 1280 in32 data paths, and 96 texture mapping units and 4th generation tensor cores. At the boost clocks of 2505 MHz, this delivers just over 15 teraflops of FP32 and FP16 compute power. The texture fill rate on this card comes in at just over 236 gigatexels per second at the stock clocks, and the 48 rasterization operation pipelines deliver just over 118 gigapixels per second of pixel fill rate. The compute specification is more than enough to tackle 1080p gaming, but the fact that we're getting so much theoretical performance from such little hardware is 100% due to the incredibly high clock speeds found in the ADA lineup. Speaking of, clocks on this card are very hard to complain about. With a base core clock of 1830 MHz and a factory boost clock of 2505 MHz, the card in reality hung out at just under 2.8 GHz a majority of the time. Even though the power delivery options on this card are pretty limited, the core was able to clock to 3 GHz without issue, but I probably wouldn't keep it this way. The card crashed once during a render, and after that I just made myself get comfortable with the out-of-the-box 2.8 GHz it offers. It's more than fast enough, and at the end of the day it's hard to complain about a GPU hitting these clock speeds. It was impressive when AMD did it, and it's also impressive now that Nvidia is doing it too. Keeping clocks high is the honestly overkill heatsink that comes with 3 fans and a pass-through design. This kept the card nice and cool, with it rarely exceeding 70°C, and when it is, it's because it's been rendering Blender scenes for something like 2 hours straight. A pretty common figure I've seen a lot in games is 67°C while operating under full clocks and power. This kind of indicates that you may be able to get away with a cheaper and smaller heatsink, or if you want to go with something like this, you can be comfortable knowing that it's a higher end solution with more mass than a lot of other flavors. Memory, and specifically cache, is where the story gets more interesting with the 4060. Remember earlier how I said that AD107 sports more transistors than GA104? Well, it's because of the cache. With 24 megs of operating L2 cache, this functions like a traditional L2 cache where it's divided amongst SMs. It's not unified like AMD's L3 Infinity cache. This means that while there's a lot more cache on the 4060 than something like a 3090, it's eating up the transistor budget and takes up a portion of the floor plan where compute logic just can't be placed. Similarly to Ampere, the L1 and texture caches remain the same moving to ADA, with 128 kilobytes of general purpose L1 per SM, and then a supplementary 64 kilobytes of texture cache shared amongst 128 FP32 CUDA cores. Kind of disappointingly though, the card only features 4 total GDDR6 memory controllers, bringing the bus width to 128 bits clocked at 17 gigabit per second. With 8 gigs of memory on this card, I think that it's ultimately fine for 1080p, but it's a downgrade from the 3060 in both capacity and bandwidth. So it's kind of a hard pill to swallow, especially since the additional L2 cache doesn't really augment main memory bandwidth in the ways that Nvidia are claiming that it does. With 272 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, the memory is where I'd target most of my overclocking efforts to try and get at least 18 or 19 gigabit per second out of the modules. This would only increase your memory bandwidth to at most 304 gigabytes per second, but with bandwidth this low, every few gigabytes here and there helps a lot. Overall though, is the RTX 4060 worth picking up when there are so many great cards also available on the market? Not to mention they're probably cheaper too. Well, it's kind of a hard recommendation at this point in 2023, or really at any point in time when it remains at this price, as the card is just too expensive. You can find them pretty consistently in the US now for under $300, which I think is a step in the right direction. But ultimately you can find a used 3070 which will outperform this card for a similar or cheaper price. If efficiency is a big concern for you, then I can understand being interested in this card as it only draws 115 watts at most. However, if value is your primary concern at this point in time, then a used 3060 Ti or 3070 is going to be a stronger choice despite those cards using more power. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you guys think about the 4060. Does it meet your performance expectations, or would you rather get something more powerful for a similar price? That's all I really have to say on the matter. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.